The sound didn't belong to the house. That was the first thought that crossed Miriam Calloway's mind when she woke at midnight. Not fear, not alarm, just that quiet, clinical certainty she had carried through 20 years of boardrooms and billion-dollar decisions. Something was wrong. Something was out of place. She sat up slowly in the dark, listening. The house was one of those old Westchester estates that groaned in the wind, so she knew its sounds the way she knew her own heartbeat. The pipes in the east corridor, the particular click of the library door when the temperature dropped. She knew every note this house was supposed to play. This was not one of them. It was a voice. Low, soft. Coming from somewhere below, Miriam reached for the small tablet on her nightstand, the one connected to the security feed, and pulled up the interior cameras before she even got out of bed. Old habit. She had learned long ago that information was always better than action taken blind. The kitchen feed showed nothing. The foyer, nothing. She scrolled to the back hallway near the sunroom, and then she stopped. There was her daughter. Audra was 7 years old and had not spoken a single word in 14 months. She was standing in the middle of the sunroom in her bare feet and her yellow pajamas, and she was watching something, someone, with an expression Miriam had not seen on her daughter's face in over a year. It took Miriam a moment to name it. She was delighted. Miriam's eyes moved to the other figure in the room. It was the new groundskeeper, the one her estate manager had brought on 3 weeks ago to handle the winter landscaping before the property went dormant. His name was Beckett Shaw. She had barely registered him beyond the paperwork her manager had placed on her desk. He was crouched down on the floor of the sunroom, near the glass wall that overlooked the dark garden, and he was doing something with his hands. Miriam leaned closer to the screen. In the pale light that came through the windows, she could just make out what he was creating against the wall. Shadow animals. A rabbit. A deer. Then something with wide, spreading wings. Audra pointed at the winged shape and looked at Beckett, and he turned to look at her, and he nodded. Yes, an eagle. He made it flap its wings slowly, and Audra's shoulders rose slightly. Not quite a laugh, but the shape of one, the held breath before it. Miriam sat very still in her darkened bedroom and watched her daughter almost laugh for the first time in 14 months. Her throat closed around something she could not name. She did not sleep again that night. She had built Calloway Capital from a single rented office in Midtown to one of the most respected independent investment management firms on the East Coast. She had done it through a particular combination of intelligence, discipline, and an almost supernatural tolerance for long hours and difficult men. Her colleagues respected her, her clients trusted her. Her board, 12 men and 2 women who had watched her navigate the 2008 crisis, the 2020 tall crash, and 3 hostile takeover attempts without flinching, considered her unshakable. None of them knew that she had spent the last 14 months feeling like she was drowning in her own house. Audra had stopped speaking the morning after the accident. It had happened on a Tuesday in October, 14 months ago, on the highway ramp near Exit 12 in Westchester. A fuel tanker had jackknifed in the early morning rain, and the cars behind it had no time. Miriam's husband, Patrick, had been driving. Audra had been in the back seat in her booster on her way to school. Miriam had been at an 8 a.m. board meeting when her phone rang. Patrick had not survived. Audra had, physically, no broken bones, no serious injuries, which the doctors at the time had called remarkable and then corrected to miraculous when they reviewed the damage to the vehicle. But when Audra woke up in the hospital room and Miriam reached for her hand and asked if she was okay, the little girl had looked at her mother with an expression that was not pain, not confusion, but something ancient and unreachable, and said nothing. She had not said a word since. The therapist called it selective mutism triggered by acute trauma. They gave Miriam pamphlets, referrals, weekly appointments. They told her it was not uncommon. They told her to be patient, to follow Audra's lead, to create a safe environment. Miriam had done everything she was told with the same methodical precision she brought to every problem in her professional life. Nothing had changed. She had watched her daughter move through the house like a small ghost, present but unreachable. Going through the motions of eating and dressing and attending the private school, Miriam had found that specialized in selective mutism and trauma recovery, but never quite returning. The light in her eyes had dimmed to something careful and guarded, and no matter how many times Miriam sat with her at bedtime, or held her hand at the kitchen table in the mornings, the distance remained. Until last night. In the morning, Miriam did not go to her office. She called her assistant at 7 and rescheduled 2 meetings, which was something she had not done voluntarily in 3 years, and then she sat in the kitchen with her coffee and waited. Beckett Shaw arrived at 7:40, the same time he always arrived, through the side gate near the garage. She watched through the kitchen window as he crossed the lawn with his tools, moving with the unhurried efficiency of a man who had done this kind of work for a long time. He was younger than she had assumed, mid-30s maybe. He had the build of someone who worked with his hands, broad through the shoulders, weathered in the particular way that came from being outdoors in all seasons. But there was something in the way he moved that didn't entirely match. Something careful, deliberate. She had noticed it before without naming it. She went out to the garden at 8:15, coffee cup in hand, which she had not done once since he had been hired. "Good morning," she said. Beckett straightened from the bed he was cutting back and looked at her without surprise. "Mrs. Calloway, how long have you been doing this work?" she asked. It came out more direct than she intended. She had not fully planned what she was going to say, which almost never happened to her. He considered the question for a moment, which she noticed. Most people filled silences immediately when she spoke to them. "About 2 years," he said. "Before that, I was in a different field." "What field?" He looked at her steadily. He had gray eyes, she noticed, and a kind of stillness about him that she associated with people who had been through something significant. "Medicine," he said. "I was a pediatric occupational therapist." Miriam was quiet for a moment. "I was on the highway that morning," Beckett said. He said it carefully, without drama, as if he had been waiting for the right moment to say it. 14 months ago, the tanker accident on Route 9A. The coffee cup was warm in her hands. The garden was very quiet. "I was 3 cars behind the crash when it happened," he said. "I had my daughter with me. We were on our way to her school. When I got to the vehicles, I knew first aid. I went to help." He paused. "I got to your husband's car first. There was nothing. I couldn't." He stopped. Started again. "Then I heard the little girl in the back seat. I stayed with her until the paramedics arrived. I kept her talking, or tried to. Mostly I kept her focused on something other than what was in the front seat." He glanced briefly at the house, at the sunroom windows. "I made animals with my hands on the headrest in front of her. She watched them until the EMTs came." Miriam's hands had gone very still around the cup. "She started to reach for one," Beckett said, "an eagle. And then the paramedics were there, and they moved me out of the way, and he looked at his hands briefly. "I didn't know her name. I didn't know yours. I just knew that the little girl in the back seat was going to be all right." Miriam set the coffee cup down on the garden wall. She did not trust herself to speak for a moment. In 20 years of negotiations and board votes and presentations to rooms full of people who were waiting for her to fail, she had almost never lost her composure completely. She was losing it now. She could feel it going the way you felt a tide going out. "Why are you here?" she said. Her voice came out flat. Not unkind, just controlled, which was the only thing she had left. "Why are you working on my grounds?" Beckett was quiet for a moment. "I saw the listing," he said. 6 months ago. I'd moved back to Westchester. My daughter's school is nearby, and I recognized the address." He met her eyes. "I thought about it for a long time before I applied. I didn't have a plan. I wanted to know she was okay, the little girl." He looked toward the house again. "I didn't know she wasn't speaking." Miriam stood very still. She was thinking clearly, more clearly than she had been in months, the way she thought when the stakes were high enough that everything irrelevant fell away. She also felt, in the back of her mind, a small and terrible question beginning to form. She went back to her office that afternoon. She had been running Calloway Capital for 11 years, and in that time she had made it a principle to know everything that happened within her firm. Not because she was controlling, She was not, by most standards, but because she believed that the people at the top of organizations were always the last to hear the truth, and she had decided early on that she would not be one of them. She pulled the file on the Route 9A accident. She had not looked at it since the lawyers had closed the estate proceedings 8 months ago. She had not been able to. Patrick had not been driving recklessly. The police report was clear on that. The tanker driver had lost control on a patch of black ice. The failure of the truck's rear brake assist system had been cited as a contributing factor. The truck was owned by a logistics contractor, Meridian Freight Solutions, which had been acquired 18 months prior by a private equity consortium. Calloway Capital had been one of the lead investors in that acquisition. Miriam had known this. She had signed off on the deal herself, had reviewed the due diligence, had approved the financing structure. What she had not known, what she had not been told, was what came next in the file, in the form of a memo dated 4 months before the accident from her own head of risk management to 2 members of her investment committee. The memo outlined a maintenance audit of Meridian's fleet. It flagged 17 vehicles with deferred brake system inspections. It recommended immediate suspension of operations for those vehicles pending review. The memo had never reached Miriam's desk. She read it twice. Then she set it down and looked at the skyline outside her office window for a long time. She thought about the board meeting she had been in when her phone rang. She thought about her 2 senior partners, Gordon Halloran and Ray Cheswick, who had been on the investment committee. She thought about the conversations they had not had with her, the information that had been managed carefully above and below her in a firm she believed she ran completely. She thought about Patrick. She thought about Audra, 7 years old, standing in the sunroom in her yellow pajamas, watching shadow animals move across a wall. She picked up her phone and called her general counsel. That evening, after Audra was in bed, Miriam went out to the garden in the dark. It was cold, early November now, and her breath came out in small white clouds. The light in the groundskeeper's cottage at the far edge of the property was on. She walked down the gravel path and knocked. Beckett opened the door and looked at her with the same unremarkable steadiness he brought to everything. He did not seem surprised. He stepped back to let her in, and she saw the small cottage had a table, 2 chairs, a kettle on the stove, and a drawing. A child's drawing, she realized, taped to the wall near the window. A horse and a stick figure with pigtails. "Your daughter?" she said. "Nora," he said. "She's 8. She's with my sister tonight." Miriam sat down at the table. She had brought the memo with her, printed, and she set it on the table between them. Beckett read it without picking it up. She watched his face. "I owe you an explanation," Miriam said, "and more than that." "You didn't know," he said. It was not a question. "I didn't," she said. "That isn't an excuse. I was the head of the firm. I was responsible for what was done in its name. But I did not know about this memo, or about the vehicles, or about—" She stopped. "Were you injured in the accident?" He was quiet for a moment. "I was burned on my right arm getting to the passenger side of another vehicle," he said. "I was out of work for 8 months. I lost my position at the hospital, the clinic where I'd been practicing for 6 years. Budget restructuring, they called it, but the timing wasn't coincidental. I was a face associated with the accident. Hospitals don't love that kind of visibility." He paused. "My daughter and I moved in with my sister for a while. I retrained. Started doing this." "Did you have a wife?" Miriam asked. She didn't know why she asked it. It came out before she could stop it. Something shifted slightly in his expression. "She passed 2 years before the accident," he said. "Cancer. It was just Nora and me." Miriam closed her eyes briefly. "I'm not telling you this so you'll feel worse," Beckett said. "I'm telling you because you asked. I'm going to find out what happened at my firm," Miriam said. "All of it. And I'm going to make it public. I know what that will cost. I've been a fiduciary of other people's money for over a decade, and I've built something I was proud of, and I understand that making this public will very likely end it. I've thought about it all day, and I'm still—" She paused. "I'm still going to do it." Beckett looked at her across the table. "And I want to know what you need," she said. "For the injury, for the career, for your daughter. I'm not trying to buy your silence. You haven't threatened me with anything. You've given me nothing but honesty. I'm asking because you are owed something real, and I intend to make sure you receive it." He was quiet for a moment. "I don't need your money," he said. "I know," she said, "but you need your work. You need your standing in your field. And your daughter needs." She stopped, because what she was going to say next felt too large and too personal for a garden cottage at 11 at night. Instead, she said, "Whatever it is that Audra needs, Nora might also need, and I have resources. I've spent 14 months applying them to the wrong things." He looked at the memo on the table. "What are you going to do about your partners?" "I'm going to give them 48 hours to resign voluntarily," Miriam said. "And if they don't, I'm going to walk into the next board meeting with documentation and give every client and every regulator the full picture, and then I'll dismantle whatever's left and start over." She met his eyes. "My lawyer thinks I'm having a breakdown. She may be right. But I think this is actually the clearest I've seen in over a year." Beckett said nothing for a moment. Then, "Do you want tea?" She almost laughed. It surprised her completely. The sound of it, rough and unexpected in that small, lit room. "Yes," she said. "Thank you." The 48 hours passed. Gordon Halloran came to her office the next morning with his own lawyer and tried to frame the memo as a risk management failure that predated his current role. Ray Cheswick sent an email, citing legal privilege and requesting she not act unilaterally before a full internal review could be conducted. Miriam had read both communications the same way she read every communication that was designed to slow her down, carefully, once, and then not again. She filed a voluntary disclosure with the SEC on a Thursday morning. She sent a personal letter to every client of the firm, 412 of them, the same afternoon. She did not have her communications team draft it. She wrote it herself at her kitchen table at midnight with a mug of cold coffee and the particular kind of focus that comes when you have already decided and all that remains is the doing. The letter explained what had happened, what had been concealed, what she had not known, and what she believed she should have known. It acknowledged that the firm bore responsibility for the maintenance failures that had contributed to the accident. It did not use the word settlement. It used the word accountability, and it used it plainly, without the softening language her lawyers had spent an entire afternoon trying to insert. By Friday morning, 2 board members had resigned. By Friday afternoon, the financial press had the story. By the weekend, Calloway Capital was the subject of coverage that was, by turns, scathing and, in a few cases, Miriam read with some surprise, admiring. She did not read most of it. She had 3 calls to return and a daughter to take to her Saturday therapy appointment. Audra's therapist, Dr. Hollins, had a small waiting room with a fish tank and a bowl of individually wrapped peppermints on the table. Miriam had sat in this room every other Saturday for 14 months, and she knew the fish by their colors, if not their names. She was staring at a blue one near the bottom of the tank when the door to the inner office opened and Audra came out. Audra was holding something in her hand, a small piece of folded paper. She crossed the waiting room to where Miriam was sitting and stood in front of her for a moment, her dark eyes very serious. Then she held out the paper. Miriam took it and unfolded it. It was a drawing made in the session, a woman and a little girl standing in a garden with something in the sky above them. Birds or, Miriam looked closer, wings. An eagle, drawn with the careful enormity that children brought to things they considered important. She looked up at her daughter. Audra was watching her with an expression Miriam had not seen in 14 months. Open, expectant, alive. "Is this us?" Miriam asked. Her voice was very quiet. Audra looked at the drawing, then at her mother. "Yes," she said, one word, barely above a whisper. Rough from disuse, rough in the way of something that had been held in too long. Miriam pulled her daughter to her and held her there in the waiting room with the fish tank humming and the peppermints on the table. And she did not try to speak, and she did not try to be composed. It was a Sunday morning, 3 weeks later, that Nora Shaw appeared in the garden for the first time. Beckett had mentioned, a few days prior, that his sister had a work emergency, and he needed to bring his daughter with him. Miriam had said, of course, without thinking too much about it. She had been in a period of relative suspension, The regulatory process was moving, her legal team was managing it. Two of her senior analysts had agreed to help her build what she was already thinking of, quietly, as the next thing, something smaller and more deliberate than Callaway Capital had ever been. She was in the kitchen when she heard it. Laughter. High and clear, from the garden, not Audra's, which she would have recognized, but the sound of another child. And then, underneath it, Audra's laugh, which she had not heard in over a year, and which was the same and also entirely different from the sound she remembered. Miriam set down her cup and went to the window. In the garden below, Nora Shaw was chasing Audra between the bare hedgerows with a stick that she was using as a wand, making elaborate proclamations about spells, and Audra was running with her hair flying behind her and her mouth open in what was unmistakably, irrevocably laughter. Beckett was standing near the garden wall, watching them, and he must have heard the door for his cousin turned and looked up at the kitchen window. And when he saw Miriam standing there, he did not smile, exactly. But something in his face settled, like a question that had been asked too long, finally finding its answer. Miriam pressed her hand flat against the cold glass for a moment. Then she went to make more coffee, because he would come in when he was ready, and they would sit at the kitchen table, the way they had started doing, on mornings when Audra was at school and Nora was at her sister's, and they would talk about things that were not work and not grief, or sometimes about things that were both, and the house would be a house again instead of a tomb, and outside the window the two girls would run and shout in the cold November garden until the light ran out. She was not certain yet what any of it would look like in a year. The firm was going to change. She was going to change. Audra was already changing, one word at a time, one drawing at a time, one Saturday morning in a waiting room at a time. She knew only this: the sound she had heard at midnight 3 months ago, the sound that didn't belong to the house, had been the sound of something coming back to life. Not just her daughter, all of them.